Welcome to the presentation of my paper, The Impact of Intra-Firm Coopetition on Strategic Renewal. My name is David Ahn. The agenda of today's presentation will be what is the motivation of the paper. I will talk about the research project, how did I conduct the whole project, and what are the contributions, implications, and further outlook. First of all, what is the phenomenon of today's project, today's paper? It's so-called intra-firm competition. It is a phenomenon which happens in almost every industry nowadays. To give an example, in the food delivery space, we have, for instance, Amazon with Amazon Fresh, who compete against, for instance, in Germany, with companies like GetNow, or Rewe Lieferservice, Bringmeister.de, but they also have another service called Prime Now, which is essentially the same service. So it is at the same time competition as well as collaboration within the boundary of the firm. So there is overlap in the market with regard to these services. So it's internal competition, but there's also internal cooperation that Amazon Fresh and Prime Now actually cooperate on logistics or customer service. Another example that I can give you today, for instance, is in the messenger space. Take, for instance, a company like Google, which has a service, which had a service like Google Messages, and they're externally competing against WhatsApp, which now belongs to Facebook. Facebook also has Facebook Messenger, but Google also had a service called Hello. Nowadays in 2021, it's probably not active anymore, but nevertheless, the phenomenon was quite prevalent back in the days. And of course, externally competing against services such as Telegram. Of course, there's other players in 2021, but as you see, Google has also another service, Hangouts. So there are a lot of internal services which basically overlap in the market, but where Google, of course, cooperates on IT, on technology standards, for instance. So it has a high managerial relevance, the phenomenon called intra-firm competition. It's also relevant in management research. First of all, how is it widely defined? It is a term that encompasses simultaneous cooperative and competitive interactions between actors. That's the general term. And the focus to date is, as I said, within the boundaries of the firm. But of course, it happens between firms at the diet level, between companies, but also of organizations in industry networks. But as I mentioned, IFC is happening within the boundary of the firm. And the unit of analysis can be like business units, departments, or also at the team level. In IFC, the phenomenon has been scrutinized quite a lot. It's quite relevant. For instance, it was studied as a driver of knowledge sharing, explorative innovation, firm performance, and also as an antecedent. For instance, it was scrutinized as what are the organizational structures and leadership styles, what is the impact on IFC, formal in hierarchical structures and informal relations as an antecedent of intra-firm competition. Also, in terms of cross-industry phenomenon, it was investigated and researched. For instance, there was a case study about a French game publisher called Ubisoft. Also, there are a lot of case studies on a very big conglomerate called Samsung, South Korean electronics manufacturer. It's also been scrutinized and, let's say, published in the media also by about companies like Tencent and Google, as I mentioned. It is a multi-unit and multi-channel phenomenon, and so it was investigated under the terms of internet and multi-channel strategies, which have amplified actually intra-firm competition, and also it is definitely prevalent within multi-unit organizations, which are basically forced to engage in competition. So what is the motivation of my paper, and what are the research gaps? So taking the angle from strategic renewal, So strategic renewal is affected by management practices such as product innovation and organizational learning. So strategic renewal, of course, there's a huge body of research, and so there has been a lot of projects in terms of what basically what are the management practices that actually affect strategic renewal, such as product innovation and organizational learning. And with regard to intra-firm competition, IFC, there is a gap here. I mean, with the exception of one research object, Samsung, the case study, IFC as a renewal practice has definitely not been scrutinized. And then what has been basically studied is Song et al. Has basically found out that dynamic capability building is actually positively influenced by IFC in the forms of dual sourcing and parallel development, and especially if it's coordinated by the office of the chairman. That is definitely something that should be further scrutinized. So there is definitely a gap because what is actually the impact of intra-firm competition on strategic renewal, and more importantly, how does maybe intra-firm competition change over time? And then what's interesting is that I really like this paper from Castagna and Oliveira, which came out quite recently in 2020, with a very granular definition of cooperation, where they basically divide it into cooperation, coordination, and collaboration. And so there haven't been any studies yet which make a differentiation in light of IFC, intra-firm competition, and strategic renewal over time. So my first research question, therefore, to fill those gaps is, does intra-firm competition influence organizational path dependencies over time? If so, how does it happen? And to what extent do paths of intra-firm competition change during the course of strategic renewal? Is something that's super interesting and I was super excited about. I chose a single case study of a major TV broadcaster, which has been out there in the German market for, I would say, now about 30 years. And it has been a market leader, has been desperately trying to transform into the digital sphere. So basically, strategic renewal has been a subject, I would say, about for 20 years. So I did a longitudinal single case study of this really multi-unit media conglomerate with 2.9 billion market cap at the time in 2020. It's over 6,500 employees. It is still in the linear TV, the market leader in German-speaking territories. So when you switch on TV, like your analog box, basically, those channels, the channels that are owned by this conglomerate, basically pop up with a probability of it, I would say, over 50% in the first 10 spots of your remote control. And of course, as I mentioned, this company has been aggressively trying to transform into the digital area, become from a very, let's say, old school TV linear broadcaster into a digital company. And it has used, as I've also shown in the paper, intra-firm competition as a practice to grow digital initiatives. Because from analog TV to digital, there have been a lot of initiatives which have led to a lot of overlap and also cooperation, especially in the content space, because of course TV companies live and die with the attractiveness of the content that they produce. By and large, this case study can be regarded as a failure case. So as you see here, probably it's a little bit disguised here because of the video. Apologies for that. It has actually failed to become a global player that it wanted to become in the digital space. It still remains quite stable in terms of revenues. If you see here on the upper right corner here, the total annual revenue since 2009 to 2020, which is here disguised in the last diagram here, it is about 4 billion revenues. The TV revenue, which I haven't shown here, but I'm telling you right now, is about flat ever since 2000 at about 2 billion, actually decreasing. So from 2.5 billion TV linear revenue to 2020 and about 2 billion revenue is actually the TV market. In the analog space, I mean, in the linear space is decreasing, and the rest that's kind of here that looks like growth is basically revenues that have been acquired in the e-commerce space, primarily with acquisition money. And as you see here, the line here is the stock price, which peaked in 2016 to over almost 45 euros. It is now, sorry for actually the video picture here, it is now at about 14, 15 euros stock price. So it's almost more than three as in terms of decrease by a factor of 3.5. So the method that I was actually conducting here is a historical case method. I actually analyzed over time the chronology of inter-firm competition. I used the extended case method, which focuses on the creation, rather than on the creation of new theory, uses an empirical case to actually extend existing theory and reconceptualize it. So we did some sort of, I would say, iterative approach between literature review, data collection, data analysis, always going back to literature review, then data collection, data analysis. So I did that essentially with 2 iterations where I conducted primary data and secondary data. I did about 25 semi-structured interviews and did over 5,200 page analysis of secondary data, coded that data instantly, came up with first, second order and aggregate codes. And in the second iteration, I basically went back, did the iteration of literature review, interpreted the data in order to take an historic perspective of path dependencies, reconstructed a historical timeline of the intra-firm competition renewal activities. And also what we did was we took a look at the so-called Wayback Machines, which actually store web pages back until from 1996 to today. So we could actually look at what kind of content were they using and how would that evolve over time, especially in terms of inter-firm competition in the content space. So this is basically a summary, or let's say a recap of what I did. Step number 1 is basically taking a look how salient is the phenomenon in terms of cooperation and competition, and also those various granularities of cooperation, coordination, cooperation, collaboration. I also took a look at understanding the organizational paths over time. This was a longitudinal data analysis, so it was over 20 years of data that I took a look at, and particularly when it came to understanding the organizational paths, I took a look at the coordination effects, complementary effects, what learning effects, what adaptive expectation effects of managerial dependence, especially in managerial cognition, which led to path dependencies over time. And in how far was that influenced by intra-firm competition? So these are the effects of path dependencies. Were they path breaking? Were new paths created? Was actually the status quo maintained? And a couple of propositions that I kind of found out is that over time, in the last 20 years, inter-firm competition that focuses on the exploitation of core resources does not renew a firm, is actually, in terms of contribution to competition theory, if it's really uncontrolled, it actually amplifies existing paths. I will actually now in the presentation, due to time constraints, only focus on these 2 columns. Inter-firm competition or uncoordinated IFC around core resources create yet new path dependencies. So this is a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy that intra-firm competition, especially if it's very much heavily focused on competition, if it's uncoordinated, actually creates new path dependencies, especially if the new paths that they're actually trying to do not actually become successful. They rely on old resources. This becomes a prophecy. So it is essentially affecting even like a cancer, I would say, additional units over time. Intra-firm competition or uncoordinated IFC without delinking to core resources and relinking to new competence remains path dependent. So normally what theory says is if you have a core competence, you got to be able to delink that core competence, that core resource, and relink it to a new activity. That hasn't happened in that case study. So it's really the contribution to competition theory is here really that there is a strong necessity by IFC to delink those core resources and relink them to a new activity. And it's really important to have this. The managers need to be able to do that. So what we saw is that there was a lack of managerial resource cognition, which led to this inability to actually delink and relink to a new activity. Intra-firm competition, uncoordinated, without success becomes path dependent itself. That is what I actually said. If the new business basically is not showing any success, you rely on your previous core resources, which you kind of then try to reuse in certain new context within IFC, but actually those that did not lead to a very good success. IFC with a strong focus in internal collaboration as opposed to just mere cooperation coordination has potential. So we saw that whenever there is a really good asset that can be really used in those new digital activities and where strong collaboration actually happens, we saw that this could be potentially a path breaking or a path breakout. Exactly where I really what I meant with delinking and relinking to a new competence, basically to a new business. And this is really the most promising things, that in terms of collaboration, instead of uncontrolled competition, strong collaboration has the potential to really be path breaking the paths and can be, I would say, called as so-called path breakouts. What are the limitations of and future research? Of course, this is a single case study. Of course, multiple cases always have a high generalizability, parsimony, and are more robust in terms of contribution to theory. Interesting in the study, many informants mentioned that they had been really dependent on external competition in terms of big companies in the big tech area like Google, YouTube, and Facebook. So I really encourage, when taking a look at intra-firm competition in this space, that there needs to be a conjunction with external competition with big players in particular. These business ecosystems have a very strong influence on the company per se. Of course, you could totally take a different angle on that case study by saying, because this is one interesting statement from an informant, says this company really has to transform radically, similar to Nokia, which became a telecommunications company from basically producing car tires and rubber boots, and that's precisely the transformation that a media company has to go through today. So I really encourage that researchers take not only the angle of IFC, this was really strongly relying on IFC, but you should also take maybe an additional angle of radical and disruptive innovation in terms of comparing that maybe to the impact of intra-firm competition and strategic renewal. Thank you very much for your attention, and if you have any questions, please feel free to shoot me a message.